picture yourself standing inside a beautiful ballroom filled with more than 200 guests. Crystal chandeliers glow above, live music fills the air, and everyone is celebrating my younger brother's engagement to the daughter of a wealthy businessman. I was 9 months pregnant, smiling through the evening because I didn't want to take attention away from him. Then a sharp contraction stopped me in my tracks. I tried to hide the pain, hoping it would pass, but another wave hit even harder. My father noticed and quickly pulled me away from the crowd. I leaned closer and whispered that I thought my water had broken and I needed to get to the hospital right away. Instead of showing concern, he glanced toward the stage where photographers were gathering everyone for family pictures. Then he looked at me and quietly said, "Don't make a scene. Call yourself a taxi. I'm busy with the family party." I froze. Another contraction nearly brought me to my knees as guests turned to watch. My father walked back with a smile, posing for pictures as if nothing had happened. Fighting back tears, I walked out of that ballroom alone. I had no idea that before the sun came up, the same father who chose a party over me would be standing outside my hospital room, begging for another chance. I stepped outside the ballroom and the cool night air hit my face, but it did nothing to ease the pain. Another contraction tightened across my stomach, forcing me to stop and grab the railing near the entrance. My breathing became uneven, and for a moment I wondered if I would even make it to the hospital. People walked past without noticing what was happening until a taxi pulled up to drop someone off. The driver looked at me for only a second before stepping out of his car. He hurried over and asked if I was in labor. I nodded, unable to say much through the pain. Without asking unnecessary questions, he opened the back door, helped me inside, and told me not to worry because he would get me to the hospital as quickly and safely as possible. His calm voice gave me something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was falling apart. As the taxi pulled away, I looked back through the window. The ballroom glowed with bright lights and music still echoed from inside. The celebration continued as if I had never been there. Within minutes, the building disappeared behind us, replaced by quiet streets and rows of city lights stretching into the distance. For the first time in years, I stopped making excuses for my father. I remembered the man he used to be before life changed our family. After my mother passed away, something inside him slowly shifted. He poured all of his attention into my younger brother. He celebrated every achievement, supported every dream, and made sure every opportunity went his way. If money was needed, he found it. If encouragement was required, he gave it freely. I told myself he was simply trying to help the child who needed him most. Meanwhile, I learned to expect less. I celebrated my successes quietly and handled my disappointments alone. Whenever he forgot an important moment in my life, I convinced myself he was just busy. Whenever promises were broken, I found another reason to forgive him. Deep down, I kept hoping that one day he would look at me with the same pride he showed my brother. Tonight destroyed that hope completely. When I begged for help, he didn't hesitate. He chose photographs, guests, and appearances over his own daughter and unborn grandchild. The truth was impossible to ignore anymore. I had spent years waiting for a moment that was never coming. Another powerful contraction made me grip the seat so tightly my hands began to shake. The driver quietly told me we were almost there. Seconds later, the taxi turned into the hospital entrance. Before the car had fully stopped, nurses were already rushing toward us with a wheelchair as the pain became stronger than ever. The hospital doors opened and everything moved faster than I could understand. Nurses rushed me into a wheelchair while another doctor asked questions about my pregnancy. Bright lights passed above me as they pushed me through long hallways. I answered as best I could between contractions, trying to stay calm even though every wave of pain felt stronger than the last. The medical team worked quickly, attaching monitors and preparing the delivery room without wasting a second. As they checked my condition, my mind drifted somewhere I didn't want it to go. Just 1 week earlier, I had sat with my father after dinner, reminding him that the baby could arrive at any time. I even joked that she might decide to come on the same day as my brother's engagement party. He laughed, wrapped his arms around me, and smiled the way he used to when I was little. "Don't worry," he had said. "If labor starts, I'll leave everything and drive you myself." Those words had stayed with me because they sounded sincere. For the first time in a long while, I felt like his daughter instead of someone standing in the background. I held on to that promise through the entire week, never imagining it would disappear the moment it became inconvenient. Now, lying in a hospital bed, I replayed that conversation over and over. Every contraction reminded me that his promise had meant nothing. The man who swore he would never let me face that moment alone had watched me walk out of a crowded ballroom by myself. It wasn't the ride to the hospital that hurt the most. It was realizing how easily he had broken his word. I reached for my phone with trembling hands. My husband had already replied to my message. He had left his business trip in another city the moment he heard I was in labor. He kept sending updates every few minutes, saying he was driving as fast as he safely could and begging me to stay strong until he arrived. Reading his messages gave me comfort because I knew someone was doing everything possible to reach me. A nurse gently squeezed my hand while another adjusted the monitor beside the bed. Their calm expressions suddenly changed. One doctor stared at the screen a little longer before quietly calling another physician over. They exchanged worried looks without saying much. The room, which had been busy but controlled only moments earlier, became noticeably quieter. More staff entered carrying additional equipment. Instructions were given in calm but urgent voices. I searched their faces for reassurance but no one smiled. Then I heard one doctor say that my baby's heartbeat wasn't responding the way they wanted. In that instant, the pain no longer frightened me as much as the fear of losing the little girl I hadn't even had the chance to hold. The room changed in an instant. Nurses moved with greater urgency, bringing in more equipment while doctors spoke in calm but serious voices. I could tell they were trying not to frighten me, but their expressions revealed enough. Someone adjusted the monitor beside my bed while another explained that they needed to watch the baby very closely. I nodded even though my heart was racing faster than I could control. Each contraction drained the little strength I had left. I looked toward the door wishing my husband would appear, but only unfamiliar faces came and went. The nurses encouraged me to stay focused and reminded me to keep breathing. Their kindness was the only thing keeping me together. I had never felt so surrounded by people yet so completely alone. Outside the delivery room, the taxi driver quietly sat in the waiting area. One of the nurses later told me that he refused to leave after bringing me to the hospital. He said he didn't want me to wake up after giving birth and find no one there. A man who had met me less than an hour earlier showed more compassion than some relatives had shown me in years. Without expecting anything in return, he simply stayed. The hours that followed felt endless. Time lost all meaning as doctors worked carefully through one complication after another. I was exhausted, frightened, and barely aware of anything except the voices encouraging me not to give up. Every minute seemed longer than the last, but the medical team never stopped fighting for both of us. Then, after what felt like the longest night of my life, I heard it. A tiny cry filled the room. For one beautiful moment, every fear disappeared. Tears rolled down my face before anyone even spoke. The nurse smiled and told me I had a healthy baby girl. Hearing those words lifted a weight I didn't know I could survive carrying. They placed my daughter in my arms and I stared at her tiny face in complete disbelief. Nothing else mattered. She was safe. Only a few minutes later, my husband rushed into the room, breathless after driving through the night. The worry on his face melted into relief the second he saw us together. He kissed my forehead, gently held our daughter, and quietly thanked every doctor and nurse who had cared for us. While we sat together, he unlocked his phone to answer the messages that had been piling up. Instead, he froze. Social media was overflowing with pictures from my brother's engagement celebration. In every photo, my father stood in the center, smiling proudly beside the happy couple. The timestamps showed those pictures had been taken while I was struggling through labor. Before either of us could say a word, a loud emergency alert echoed through the hospital hallway, and the peaceful moment around us was suddenly interrupted once again. The loud announcement echoed through the hallway, making everyone in the room look toward the door. For a moment my heart sank. After everything that had already happened, I feared it was another emergency involving my daughter. A nurse quickly checked on us and reassured me that the alert had nothing to do with our room. I let out a slow breath and held my baby a little closer, thankful she was sleeping peacefully in my arms. A few minutes later, 2 nurses passed by speaking quietly. My husband stepped into the hallway to find out what had happened. When he returned, his expression had completely changed. "The emergency started at your brother's engagement party," he said softly. I stared at him, confused. He explained that my brother's future father-in-law had suddenly collapsed in front of the guests during the celebration. One moment everyone had been laughing and raising their glasses. The next, music stopped, People rushed across the ballroom and someone called for an ambulance. What had been planned as the happiest evening for both families had ended in complete confusion. Guests who had spent hours worrying about expensive decorations and perfect photographs forgot about all of it within seconds. The ballroom emptied as emergency crews arrived. Conversations about business connections and wedding plans disappeared. The only thing anyone cared about was whether the man would survive. News spread quickly between both families. My husband's phone continued buzzing with messages. Some relatives asked for updates from the hospital, while others shared what they had witnessed at the party. There was even talk that the wealthy family wanted to postpone any discussion about the wedding until they understood what would happen next. Suddenly, the engagement that had seemed so important only hours earlier no longer mattered. I listened quietly without saying much. My attention stayed on my daughter as she slept peacefully against my chest. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, reminding me how quickly life could change. Looking at her, I realized how meaningless appearances became when real fear entered the room. Money, status, and grand celebrations could never protect anyone from life's unexpected moments. For the first time that entire night, nobody was talking about fancy clothes, family reputation, or perfect photographs. Nobody cared who had impressed the guests or whose speech had received the loudest applause. Every conversation centered on health, family, and hope. The silence inside my hospital room felt strangely comforting after everything I had endured. I thought perhaps the night had finally settled. Then I heard hurried footsteps racing down the hallway. A familiar voice called my name once. Then again louder than before. The shouting came closer with every second until it stopped right outside my hospital room door. I immediately recognized the voice. It was my father. The hospital room door swung open before anyone could answer the knock. My father rushed inside, breathing heavily as though he had run through the entire building. He looked nothing like the confident man who had stood smiling beneath the crystal chandeliers only a few hours earlier. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie hung loose around his neck, and the color had drained from his face. For the first time that night he looked frightened instead of proud. His eyes immediately found the baby in my arms. He took a hesitant step forward before stopping beside the bed. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here." His voice shook as he spoke, and for a brief moment, I almost believed he had come simply to meet his granddaughter. The room remained silent while everyone waited for what he would say next. Then he cleared his throat. "The engagement." He began carefully. "Everything has fallen apart." He explained that my brother's future father-in-law was still receiving treatment and both families were overwhelmed. The future in-laws were upset, confused, and questioning everything. He kept repeating that emotions were running high and misunderstandings were making the situation worse. Then he looked directly at me. "They trust you," he said. "You've always been calm. They respect you. If you speak to them, maybe you can help settle everything before this turns into something permanent." I stared at him, barely believing what I was hearing. He hadn't rushed to the hospital because he couldn't bear missing the birth of his first granddaughter. He hadn't come because he wanted to make sure I was safe. He had come because he needed something. "The family needs you," he added, taking another step closer. I looked down at my sleeping daughter before raising my eyes to meet his. My voice stayed calm, but every word carried years of disappointment. "Did the family need me when I begged you for a ride?" No one answered. The silence spread across the room so completely that even the steady beeping of the heart monitor sounded louder than before. My father's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. At that moment, my younger brother slowly walked into the room. He had arrived only seconds earlier and had heard everything from the doorway. His eyes moved from me to our father, trying to understand what he had just heard. "You told her to take a taxi?" he asked quietly. Our father lowered his head without answering. My brother looked at me, then at the baby sleeping peacefully in my arms. His face filled with disbelief and shame. "I didn't know," he whispered. Nobody moved. Nobody tried to defend what had happened. The excuse about protecting the party no longer sounded reasonable. Standing in that hospital room, surrounded by exhausted doctors, my husband, and my newborn daughter, the truth was impossible to hide. Even my brother could no longer pretend our father had made the right choice. Word spread through the family faster than I expected. Within the next hour, relatives began arriving at the hospital one after another. Some came to see the baby, while others wanted to understand what had happened after hearing different versions of the story. The room slowly filled with familiar faces and the quiet atmosphere disappeared. At first, a few relatives tried to defend my father. He was under a lot of pressure. The engagement was important. He probably wasn't thinking clearly. They spoke as if one difficult evening could explain everything. I listened without interrupting because I knew this wasn't really about that night. It was about years of choices that had led to this moment. Then another aunt quietly shook her head. "This didn't start today," she said. Everyone turned toward her. She admitted she had watched my father put my brother first for years but never found the courage to speak up. Birthday celebrations were planned around him. Family vacations changed whenever he wanted something different. My achievements were acknowledged with a smile, while his were celebrated as major family events. She confessed that she noticed the difference long ago but convinced herself it wasn't her place to interfere. Her words opened a door that had stayed locked for years. Another relative remembered how my father skipped my college award ceremony because my brother had a sports competition on the same day. Someone else recalled the family dinner where my promotion was barely mentioned before the conversation returned to my brother's latest business idea. One memory after another filled the room. For years everyone had seen the pattern, yet almost nobody had challenged it. My younger brother stood silently through every story. The more he heard, the more his expression changed. Finally, he looked directly at our father. "Is it true?" he asked. "Did she tell you she was in labor?" Our father nodded without meeting his eyes. "And you really told her to call a taxi?" The room became completely still. When our father quietly admitted it was true, my brother stepped back in disbelief. "How could you do that?" he asked, his voice breaking. "She was about to give birth. She's your daughter." Our father tried to explain that he had panicked and didn't want the engagement celebration ruined, but the words sounded empty before they were even finished. "I never asked you to choose me over her," my brother said. "You made that choice yourself." His voice carried years of guilt he never knew he had. He realized he had benefited from attention he had never requested while I quietly accepted being overlooked. No one argued anymore. The image my father had spent years protecting, of the devoted parent who always held the family together, crumbled inside that hospital room. There were no photographers, no smiling guests, and no elegant speeches left to hide behind. Only the truth remained, and for the first time, everyone was finally willing to face it. Later that evening, after most of the relatives had gone home, the hallway outside my hospital room became quiet again. My husband stepped out with our daughter for a routine checkup, leaving me alone for a few minutes. A gentle knock came at the door. My father stood there. He looked exhausted, as though the weight of the day had finally caught up with him. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. I nodded and he slowly walked inside. He pulled a chair closer to my bed but didn't sit immediately. For the first time in my life, he didn't begin with excuses or long explanations. He simply waited. The silence between us felt different. Finally, he sat down and lowered his eyes. "I'm listening," he said. Those 3 words meant more than any apology he had offered earlier. I took a deep breath and spoke calmly. I wasn't interested in making him feel guilty. I only wanted him to understand what years of disappointment had felt like. I reminded him about birthdays he forgot because my brother had other plans. I talked about school events where I searched the audience for his face, only to realize he had never arrived. I mentioned promises to spend time together that were cancelled at the last minute because something involving my brother always seemed more important. I remembered the day I earned my first promotion at work. I had called him hoping he would be proud. He congratulated me quickly before asking if I could help celebrate my brother's newest business idea that same weekend. Even one of my happiest moments quietly became about someone else. None of those memories sounded dramatic on their own. Together they told the story of a daughter who slowly stopped expecting to matter. He never interrupted. His head stayed lowered while I continued. "I didn't stop trusting you tonight," I said gently. "That happened a long time ago." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. Tonight only showed me that nothing had really changed. I explained that when he told me to call a taxi, I wasn't shocked because of the words themselves. Deep inside, I had already learned where I stood in his list of priorities. Hearing him choose the engagement party over me simply confirmed what years of smaller moments had been teaching me all along. Tears rolled down his face before he quietly wiped them away. "I thought I was doing my best," he whispered. "I know you probably believed that," I replied. "But love isn't measured by intentions. It's measured by the choices people make." He sat silently, unable to argue. At that moment I think he finally understood the truth. He hadn't lost his daughter because of one terrible decision outside a ballroom. He had lost her little by little through forgotten promises, missed moments, and years of making her feel like she would always come second. That night didn't break our relationship. It simply revealed how broken it had already become. A few days later we finally left the hospital with our daughter safely in our arms. Walking through those doors felt like stepping into a completely different life. The pain of what had happened hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled every thought. My attention was focused on the tiny girl sleeping peacefully beside me. She reminded me that some endings quietly become the beginning of something much better. The weeks that followed settled into a simple routine. Sleepless nights, early morning feedings, and countless small moments filled our home with a kind of happiness I had never experienced before. My husband stood beside me through every challenge. Whether I was exhausted, overwhelmed, or simply needed someone to listen, he was always there. For the first time, I understood what it felt like to depend on someone without worrying they would let me down. Slowly, I stopped chasing approval that had never truly been mine to earn. I no longer waited for phone calls that rarely came or searched for signs that my father might finally treat me differently. I accepted something that had taken years to understand. Real love doesn't have to be begged for or constantly proved. It should be given freely without conditions or comparisons. Our daughter became the center of our little world. Every smile, every tiny laugh, and every new milestone reminded us of what mattered most. Instead of spending my energy trying to fix old family problems, I invested it in building the kind of childhood I wished I had known myself. My younger brother reached out several times after everything that happened. At first, our conversations were short and careful. He admitted he had been so used to our father's behavior that he never questioned it. Looking back, he realized how many moments he had accepted without understanding what they cost me. He apologized not because he had caused the favoritism, but because he had never recognized the pain it created. Little by little, we began rebuilding a relationship based on honesty instead of silence. My father also came to visit. The first time I wasn't ready to see him. I quietly stayed inside while my husband explained that I needed more time. A week later he returned with a small gift for his granddaughter. That day I opened the door and allowed him to meet her for a few minutes. We spoke politely, but neither of us pretended everything had been repaired. Sometimes I welcomed him inside. Sometimes I thanked him for coming and asked him to leave. There was no anger in those choices anymore. Only peace. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for my father to decide my place in the family. I was deciding what place he would have in mine. That freedom didn't erase the past, but it allowed me to move forward without carrying its weight every single day. 1 year later, our home was filled with laughter as we celebrated our daughter's first birthday. The party looked nothing like my brother's engagement celebration. There were no crystal chandeliers, famous guests, or expensive decorations. We didn't need any of those things. A few colorful balloons, a homemade cake, and a backyard full of smiling faces were more than enough. The people who came weren't there because of status or family expectations. They came because they genuinely cared about us. Close friends helped decorate the yard. Our neighbors brought homemade food and small gifts. Children ran across the grass while my daughter laughed every time someone sang to her. The entire afternoon felt peaceful in a way I had never experienced at large family events. Among the guests was someone I never expected to see again after that terrible night. The taxi driver accepted our invitation with a warm smile. He looked surprised when I thanked him once more for refusing to leave the hospital until he knew I was safe. He quietly said anyone would have done the same. I smiled because I knew that wasn't true. Some of my own relatives hadn't shown that kind of kindness when I needed it most. Yet a complete stranger had treated me with compassion without asking for anything in return. I wanted my daughter to grow up knowing people like him still existed. My father arrived a little later. He didn't expect to be the center of attention. Over the past year he had stopped making promises he couldn't keep. Instead he showed up consistently. Sometimes he visited just to read a story to his granddaughter. Sometimes he simply asked how we were doing before quietly heading home. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but he finally understood that actions mattered far more than apologies. Watching him gently hand my daughter a small birthday gift, I realized forgiveness didn't always mean forgetting. It meant allowing someone the chance to become better while protecting your own peace. As the sun began to set, I looked around the yard. My husband stood beside me, my daughter laughed with pure joy, friends talked comfortably, and everyone present had chosen to be there out of love. That was the family I wanted my little girl to grow up with. I finally understood something I wish I had learned years earlier. Family isn't measured by the name you share or the pictures you take together. It's measured by the people who stand beside you when life becomes difficult. So I'll leave you with one question. If your own father told you to call a taxi while you were about to give birth because a party mattered more, would you ever trust him with your child again?